At the end of the 19th century, the United States was a young country with an almost violent energy. Everything seemed to move fast. Cities were growing upward, trains were crossing territories that had barely been drawn on maps, and fortunes were being created at a speed that would have seemed indecent in any European court. In New York, in Chicago, in Pittsburgh, money was not inherited. It was conquered. It was raised amid factory smoke, mines, steel, oil, and banks that seemed to multiply as if someone had decided that wealth was a national experiment. And yet, there was something that could not be manufactured in a workshop or purchased on a stock exchange, something that money by itself did not know how to build. Past, a surname with centuries behind it, a coat of arms with stories of war, alliances, and betrayals, a castle that was not a new mansion with a European facade, but truly ancient stone, stained by generations, a title that did not sound like a private club, but like historical continuity. In America, a millionaire could raise a palace in 2 years, but that palace had no echoes. It was big, yes, impressive, yes, but it could not pretend that royal weddings, conspiracies, cursed inheritances, fires, exiles, impossible reconciliations had taken place there. There were no ghosts. On the other side of the Atlantic, Europe was the opposite. There, the past was not an accessory. It was the heir. There were castles that had spent centuries looking at the same valley. There were titles that were pronounced as if they were part of the geography. There were families that did not need to convince anyone of their importance, because that importance was written on the walls, in the portraits, in the endless genealogies. But Europe, at that very moment, was beginning to have a problem that the United States did not have. The money was no longer enough. The fields no longer produced as before. Traditional rents were eroding. Maintaining a huge house was more expensive every year. Taxes were rising. And above all, the world was changing. Modern wealth was moving toward industry, toward finance, toward global trade. And many European families, accustomed to living off prestige and land, found themselves facing something humiliating. They could have a castle, but they could not afford the roof. That is where the central idea of this story appears, the tension that will pull us along throughout the entire documentary. While Europe was losing economic power, America was producing millionaires faster than it knew what to do with them. And then a question arises that seems simple, but explains an entire century of marriages, purchases, scandals, and silences. What happens when the newest money in the world meets the oldest prestige? What happens in many cases is a trade. An unwritten exchange, but perfectly understood by those who practice it. America offers what Europe needs: liquidity, restorations, checks that can save entire properties. Europe offers what America desires: titles, history, surnames that sound like continuity. It is a market of intangible things with very real contracts. Suddenly, the Atlantic stops being a border. It becomes a bridge. An American millionaire travels to Europe and does not only visit museums, he visits properties. He walks through ancient halls as someone inspecting an investment plot. He asks about inheritances, about debts, about the condition of the walls. And he discovers something that in his country was unthinkable, that a castle can be for sale. And at the same time, an American heiress crosses the ocean with impeccable dresses and a surname famous in New York, but with a persistent sensation, that of being in a theater where everyone knows the script except her. Because in Europe, her money is respected, yes, but her lack of past is noticeable. Sometimes it is expressed with a smile, sometimes with a look, sometimes with an apparently innocent question. What family do you come from? And the answer, however rich it may be, never sounds the same as a lineage of 8 centuries. This is where the phenomenon becomes almost inevitable. Americans buying castles. American women buying titles through marriage, not because they sign a receipt, but because the logic works as an exchange. An enormous dowry in return for a surname that opens doors which money in America did not fully open. Money buying history, or at least trying to buy it, as if it were possible to acquire the symbolic weight of Europe in the same way one acquires a company. But this story is not a pretty postcard. It is not only a parade of carriages, gilded halls, and dinners with candelabras. If we look closely, beneath the glamour, there are far more brutal forces pushing all the characters. The first force is the craving for legitimacy. For many American millionaires, money was a victory, but also a kind of accusation. You are rich, yes, but what are you besides rich? Europe offered an elegant answer: to be a count, to be a duchess, to be a princess, to have an official place in the oldest social hierarchy of the Western world. It was not just vanity, it was a way of closing an invisible wound. The wound of the upstart, of the nouveau riche who knows that his fortune can disappear in one bad generation, while titles seem to survive any crisis. The second force is the European aristocratic decline. Not all of it, of course, but a significant part of that nobility lived a contradiction. They still represented prestige, but were beginning to lose the material capacity to sustain it. And when sustaining it means maintaining hundreds of rooms, gardens, servants, stables, endless restorations, pride can bend. It does not always break, but it bends, just enough to accept agreements that once would have been unthinkable. The third force is the brutal cultural clash, because although money and title may fit on paper, real life is something else. The American who arrives with a practical mindset collides with an aristocracy that operates through rituals and symbols. The heiress who has grown up with a certain freedom discovers that in a European noble house, freedom is a decorative concept. There are protocols, expectations, silences. There's a correct way to sit, to speak, to relate to others. And mistakes are not punished with a fine, they are punished with contempt. The fourth force, the most painful, is the personal tragedy behind the glamour. Because this exchange is rarely neutral for individuals. An agreement that saves a castle can destroy a life. A marriage that unites two worlds can become a prison. And many times, history will remember the title, but will forget the price someone paid to obtain it. In the middle of all this, we are going to follow a recurring figure, a human face that allows us not to get lost in the tide of names and places. An American heiress whose fate sums up the logic of this era, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Not because her story is the only one, nor even because it is the most extreme, but because it works as a key. Consuelo is one of those people who are born inside a fortune that seems infinite, and yet discover that money does not always mean control. Her life will help us understand why these alliances were so desired, so negotiated, and so dangerous. Because when prestige becomes a commodity, someone ends up being the currency. And if all this sounds distant, like a curiosity from another century, it is worth remembering one thing. This story is not only about aristocrats and millionaires, it is about how societies decide who belongs, who deserves respect, who has legitimacy, and about how, when those rules begin to change, the people with resources try to buy the place they feel they lack. In the coming chapters, we're going to see castles sold, titles used as lifelines, entire families reshaped by a dowry. We will see glamour, yes, but we will also see silences, humiliations, pacts, and losses. Because the Atlantic did not only transport money, it also transported impossible expectations. To understand why Europe was for sale, we first have to understand what was happening on the other side of the ocean. In the last decades of the 19th century, the United States entered a phase of growth so accelerated that even its own protagonists had trouble understanding what was happening. Fortunes that in Europe would have taken generations to build appeared in a matter of years, sometimes months. The country seemed like a machine designed to produce wealth without rest, and those who knew how to place themselves in the right place at the right time saw their names go from anonymity to financial headlines almost overnight. The railroads stitched the territory together like a network of steel veins. Oil transformed entire regions into centers of economic power. Steel raised cities into the sky. Banking learned to move figures that no European state would have handled comfortably. Money flowed, multiplied, was reinvested. And with it, there appeared a new social class, the American millionaires. Surnames that today sound almost mythical to us, Vanderbilt, Astor, Gould, Rockefeller, were, in reality, extraordinarily young. They did not speak of medieval castles or dynastic wars, but of docks, locomotives, oil wells, trusts, and mergers. They were names associated with ingenuity, with business aggressiveness, with an almost ruthless capacity to dominate entire sectors of the economy. And yet, there was a problem that none of those balance sheets could solve. They had money, They did not have lineage. In Europe, the surname preceded the individual. It was an automatic letter of introduction. In the United States, the surname was, at best, a recent brand. It could impress by its size but not by its historical depth. And in a society that was beginning to obsess over social hierarchy, that difference weighed more than many were willing to admit in public. High society in America became a stage of permanent compensation. Gigantic mansions sprang up in New York, Newport, or Fifth Avenue, not only as homes, but as statements of intent. Ceilings higher than the neighbors, longer halls, more theatrical staircases. Everything had to scream success. Everything had to prove that money was not a passing accident, but something worthy of respect. The balls were excessive, almost obscene in their scale. Invitations that functioned as exclusion lists. If you were inside, you were someone. If not, your wealth might mean nothing. People competed over decoration, over music, over who could bring the most famous artist or the most expensive chef. Each event was a silent battle for social recognition. But that competition had a very clear limit. You could build the largest hall in the country and still feel that, deep down, you were performing a play without tradition, that everything was new, too new, that the luxury was not supported by centuries of custom but by recent checks. This is where a key figure appears to understand this obsession, Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was not simply rich. She was aware, in an almost ruthless way, of what wealth meant and what it did not. She understood that money opened doors, but did not guarantee the definitive respect of a society that, even in the United States, was starting to copy European codes. For her, it was not enough to be a millionaire. One had to be legitimate. Alva saw high society as a system that could be conquered if one played intelligently. She did not accept the role of upstart. She did not accept that her surname would be treated as something provisional. And she was willing to use every resource at her disposal, social, economic, even emotional, to ensure that her family would not only be rich, but recognized as part of an incontestable elite. Her obsession with status was not superficial. It was strategic. She understood that money could disappear, be divided, diluted, but a well-placed surname could survive crises, divorces, even partial ruin. And that is where her gaze began to turn, with increasing insistence, toward Europe. Because Europe had precisely what America could not manufacture. In Europe, the surname creates the palace. In America, the palace tries to create the surname. That difference sums up the entire tension of the moment. In the old world, the stones came first. Power accumulated slowly, layer upon layer, until the building was almost a natural consequence of the lineage. In the New World, the process was reversed. The building was erected with the hope that, in time, that building would generate history. And not all American millionaires were willing to accept that this process might take generations. Some wanted to accelerate time, to buy, once and for all, what they had not inherited. For Alva Vanderbilt, and for others like her, Europe stopped being merely a cultural destination. It became a solution, a place where American money could be transformed into something that in the United States remained elusive, a legitimacy that did not need explanation. That explains why so many American families began to look across the Atlantic not with tourists' eyes, but with strategists' eyes. It was not only about admiring castles, but about asking who owned them, why they were in trouble, what it cost to maintain them, and what could be obtained in exchange for saving them. American money did not want only luxury, it wanted permanence. It wanted to stop being a novelty and become tradition. And in that desire, there is something profoundly human. It is not only ambition, it is fear. Fear that everything achieved might vanish. Fear that in 2 generations the surname will mean nothing. Fear of being remembered only as rich and not as important. Thus, while in America ever grander balls were being celebrated, beneath that music there was a constant unease, the feeling that money by itself was not enough to guarantee a definitive place in history. And if America had money without history, Europe had history but was beginning to run out of money. That imbalance was going to turn the Atlantic into something more than an ocean. It was going to turn it into a symbolic trade route where new fortunes and ancient titles would begin to encounter one another, negotiate, and, in many cases, destroy one another. At the end of the 19th century, Europe still seemed from the outside the natural center of the world. Its capitals commanded respect. Its palaces glittered under crystal chandeliers, its salons filled with uniforms, jewels, and surnames that seemed to have spent centuries practicing the same choreography. But beneath that surface, there was an uncomfortable reality. The continent that had dominated for so long was beginning to lose the economic battle against a new force coming from the other side of the Atlantic. The European aristocracy had been designed for a world before industry. Its traditional wealth did not depend on factories or global markets, but on something slower and older: land. Agricultural rents, feudal rights converted into income, forests, mills, farms, small towns entirely in the hands of one family. For centuries, that system had worked because time was on its side. Land always produced something. People always needed to eat. The peasant always paid in one way or another. But in industrial Europe, land was no longer a guarantee. Agricultural prices moved with international markets. Cheap imports from America hit the income of many landowners. Peasants became workers and left behind their traditional dependents. Cities grew, and with them there arose a kind of power that no longer automatically bowed before a title. And as if that were not enough, modern states began to do something that the old families hated. They charged them. Taxes increased. Governments needed to finance modern armies, infrastructure, larger bureaucracies. And an ever greater part of that money had to come, at last, from those who had spent centuries living protected by privileges. In countries like France, the aristocracy had been struck much earlier by revolutions. In others, the process was slower but just as inevitable. The state began to look at the castles as properties, not as untouchable symbols. That opened a silent wound. Maintaining a castle was not like maintaining a large house. It meant maintaining an entire organism. Leaking roofs, entire wings left unused, inefficient heating systems, hundreds of windows, stables, gardens, staff, enormous kitchens. The palaces were beautiful precisely because they had been born in an age when efficiency did not matter. But in the modern era, that beauty was a constant bill. This is how many European nobles began to live a daily contradiction. They still walked through corridors decorated with tapestries and portraits of ancestors, while counting coins to pay for the winter coal. At this point enters our recurring figure number 2, an impoverished European aristocrat. Not one of the great names that could still sustain their power with political influence or investments, but a duke, a count, a lesser prince of a particular region, someone with a surname that opened doors, but with accounts that no longer balanced. Imagine his situation. From childhood, he had been taught that his family was part of Europe's natural order, that his duty was to represent continuity, that his house was not just a possession, it was an institution, a symbol of his region, a living extension of history. And yet now, as an adult, he found himself doing something almost unthinkable, negotiating with bankers, talking about mortgages, selling portraits of his ancestors, renting out wings of the palace, reducing staff, and still continuing to greet people at receptions as if nothing had changed. That is the key: appearance versus reality. On the outside, the facades were still glorious. The dinners were still full of silver and porcelain. The invitations still used titles and protocols as if the world had not moved an inch since the year 1750. European nobles were experts at sustaining an image because their power depended, in large part, on that image continuing to exist. But on the inside, many of those houses were in the red. The account books were filling with uncomfortable numbers, debts to banks, family loans, desperate attempts to find new sources of income that would not destroy their pride. Because for many of them, the problem was not only economic, it was moral. Accepting new money implied accepting a new world, a world in which the surname did not guarantee authority, a world in which an industrialist could enter the same salon as a duke, and perhaps, over time, be more influential than him. That explains why, for some nobles, selling was not an option. They preferred to live with a cold castle rather than admit that their lineage needed outside help. And yet, reality was relentless. The roofs collapsed all the same. The taxes arrived all the same. Maintenance did not stop just because someone had pride. They had centuries of history, but no money to heat the corridors. And that phrase is not just a pretty image, it is almost literal. There are testimonies of families who closed entire wings of their mansions in winter because they could not maintain them. Sealed halls, dark rooms, galleries that opened only when there were important visitors. They lived in a small part of the palace while the rest became a silent museum of a grandeur that could no longer be sustained. This impoverished aristocrat, our recurring figure, did not see himself as a seller. He saw himself as a guardian, a temporary custodian of something that had to pass intact to the next generation. But sometimes, the next generation did not want that burden or could not carry it. And then the inevitable question appeared, if I cannot maintain it, what do I do with all this? At that moment, Europe became vulnerable to a solution that a few years earlier would have seemed absurd: America. Because while Europe was struggling with crumbling castles, on the other side of the ocean there were families desperately searching for something to buy with their money. History, legitimacy, roots. European nobles had accumulated prestige, but no liquidity. American millionaires had liquidity, but no prestige. It was a perfect symmetry, almost dangerous, because it invited transaction. And when these two crises met, an unexpected market was born: the market of prestige. A market where not only properties were sold, surnames were sold, marriages were sold, titles were sold in the form of alliances. The right to say, "My family belongs to something older than this money," was sold. On paper, it could seem like a logical exchange. In reality, it was going to be a volatile mixture of impossible expectations, cultural clashes, wounded pride, and private tragedies. Because when money enters a salon where previously only blood ruled, nothing is ever the same again. Part 5. Consuelo Vanderbilt, the most expensive dowry in England. There are stories that explain an entire phenomenon just by putting one name on the table. If until now we have spoken of abstract forces, new money seeking old prestige, proud aristocrats with accounts in the red, here everything lands on one person, on one particular girl, on one particular wedding, and on one particular figure that, in its time, sounded like a slap in the face to half of Europe: the dowry of Consuelo Vanderbilt. Because when the press and the salons on both sides of the Atlantic began to whisper about what was being negotiated, it was no longer only about love or status. It was a deal, an exchange, a purchase wrapped in lace. Consuelo was the daughter of one of the most famous fortunes in the United States. Vanderbilt meant railroads, magnates, impossible mansions, and above all, it meant a kind of wealth that in Europe still seemed almost vulgar, gigantic, recent, noisy. But Alva Vanderbilt, the mother, did not want that wealth to remain in the category of new money. She wanted something harder to obtain than a palace on Fifth Avenue. She wanted legitimacy. Alva understood something before many others. In Europe, a person could have less money than an American industrialist, and yet be socially superior simply because of the surname. So she became obsessed with turning dollars into lineage. And she found the perfect opportunity in a family that had everything except what America could provide. The Duke of Marlborough was not just any aristocrat. His title was associated with one of the great legends of British nobility, and his residence, Blenheim Palace, was not a manor house. It was a monument, a symbol, a piece of propaganda turned into stone. But Blenheim was also a money-eating machine. Roofs, galleries, gardens, staff, constant repairs. By the end of the 19th century, the palace was as impressive as it was costly, and traditional income was no longer enough to sustain the myth without going into debt. And then America appeared with its favorite solution: paying. The wedding took place in the year 1895, and with it, one of the most talked about social deals of the era was sealed. Consuelo, young, beautiful, educated to shine in a salon, was given to a man she barely knew, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill. Outwardly, everything was presented as a modern fairy tale, the American heiress who conquers the heart of a British duke. In reality, it was something else, a union designed to save a palace and elevate a surname. The figures circulated as rumors and as headlines, and something important: the exact numbers vary depending on the source, because one part was discussed in private, another was inflated in the press, another was negotiated through clauses and annuities. But the order of magnitude was clear to anyone who could add: People spoke of millions of dollars in dowry, around 2.5 million is often mentioned, and, in addition, of a considerable annual income that would guarantee constant liquidity. Translated into the language of the time, this was not a dowry, it was a rescue. And Consuelo knew it, not necessarily the exact financial details, but she knew the outcome. She was the bridge, the price, the ticket of entry. Here, the cruelest part of the phenomenon appears. The deal was not sealed only in offices, it was sealed inside a home, with a mother pushing and a daughter yielding. Alva Vanderbilt pressured Consuelo with an intensity that, seen from today, sounds almost unbearable. In that world, a daughter did not marry only for desire, she married for strategy. But even by the standards of that society, the level of pressure was extreme. Consuelo had affections, had hopes, there were even other names around. But none of that mattered in the face of the will of a woman determined to manufacture aristocracy by means of a checkbook. And when the day came, the spectacle was perfect. Dress, flowers, guests, headlines, the kind of wedding that seems designed so that the public will believe in the myth. And yet, inside the dress was a person entering a life she had not chosen. Because what comes next is what is rarely told when people speak of dollars for titles. They tell of the restored palace, but not the loneliness. They tell of the carriage photograph, but not the silent night in an enormous room. They tell of the added title, but not what is lost when one lives as a foreigner in a place where, no matter how much they call you Duchess, you will always be the American. Consuelo arrived at Blenheim, and suddenly, everything that to the world was glamour could feel, to her, like a cold stage. Rigid protocols, infinite expectations, a life under observation, and a marriage that, from the start, lacked what sustains a couple when the lights of the salon go out: genuine affection. The Duke was not seeking love. He wanted continuity and financial stability. And Consuelo, in practice, was part of that package. She could fulfill her role, she could smile, she could sustain conversations and organize receptions. But she could not buy something that the agreement had never included: an authentic bond. Meanwhile, American money began to work its visible magic. Castles restored with American money. That phrase is not a metaphor, it is a literal description of what happened in many noble houses. At Blenheim, improvements, repairs, and maintenance became possible again. What had been disguised decay became splendor once more. The corridors seemed eternal again, not merely old, and from the outside, the system seemed to work. But Consuelo paid the price every day, in letters, in testimonies, and in later recollections. Without needing to dramatize it beyond what it already is, one constant line appears: emotional isolation, a sadness that does not show in photographs. It was not only the marriage, it was the feeling of living to sustain a structure, the feeling of being useful but not loved, of being celebrated but not understood. And this is where this story becomes the emotional anchor of the documentary, because it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What does success mean in this market of prestige? Is success the fact that a palace remains standing, that a family keeps the title, that an American heiress can add Duchess to her name? If the system is measured in buildings, it was a triumph. If it is measured in lives, it was a bill. In time, reality imposed itself. The relationship deteriorated, and what had been presented as a fairy tale ended like so many operations disguised as romance, with distance, with rupture, with wounds. Consuelo would end up separated and, years later, divorced. And although her later life would include other stages, other decisions, other paths, the core of the story had been written from the beginning. Her youth was used as social capital. That is why, when someone says that the Americans bought Europe, it is worth remembering this scene. It was not only stone and land that were bought, human time was bought as well. Years of life were bought from people who, in theory, had everything, but who, in practice, could not choose. And there the phrase remains, because it sums up the entire paradox of this exchange. Europe gained a restored castle, Consuelo lost a life. And the most unsettling thing is that, as famous as her story is, it was not an isolated case. It was not even the most extreme in every sense. It was, rather, the model, the proof that the market worked and that there were more families willing to sell prestige. and more American heiresses destined to buy it with their own biographies. And she was not the only one. After the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt, something became clear to the elites on both sides of the Atlantic. The system worked. It was not a romantic exception nor an extravagant oddity. It was a reproducible model. It had rules, intermediaries, expectations, and measurable results. And, as always happens when a model proves effective, it began to be repeated. That was when a term appeared that, in time, would sum up an entire era. Dollar princesses. It was not an official title nor a legal category. It was a social label, sometimes ironic, sometimes cruel, that designated the American heiresses who crossed the ocean laden with dollars to marry members of the European aristocracy. Young, rich, educated women sent, explicitly or implicitly, to transform money into status and status into family legitimacy. The term became popular in the British press, but it was soon understood all over Europe. There was no need to explain much. Everyone knew what was being talked about. American women with new fortunes, aristocrats with ancient surnames, and marriages that looked like fairy tales until you examined them up close. In the United Kingdom, the phenomenon was especially visible. The British nobility, with its rigid system of titles and its obsession with family continuity, was the perfect destination for these alliances. Dukes, earls, and lords watched their properties deteriorate, while American heiresses arrived with dowries capable of financing complete restorations, paying historic debts, and returning to the family a standard of living that had seemed lost. From the outside, it looked like an elegant invasion. Magazines wrote about dresses, jewels, receptions. But in practice, many of these women entered houses where affection was secondary, and the main expectation was to fulfill a role, produce heirs, sustain prestige, and not make too much noise. In France, the process was different, but just as revealing. The French aristocracy, struck earlier by the Revolution and by profound political changes, no longer had the formal power it once did, but it still possessed something very valuable: symbolic capital, castles, names, ties to old cultural Europe. For many American heiresses, marrying a French count or marquis did not mean entering political power, but entering a refined historical narrative associated with art, literature, and style. Even so, social rigidity in France was no less. The American women were scrutinized, their accent, their manners, their direct way of speaking. In the United States, frankness was a virtue. In certain European salons, it was a threat. Many dollar princesses soon discovered that money opened the door, but did not guarantee real acceptance. In Germany, the phenomenon took on a different tone. There, the aristocracy was deeply linked to military, bureaucratic, and regional structures. Marrying an American heiress could be seen with suspicion, even with disdain. Foreign money was useful, but origin mattered. Even so, there were marriages, discreet alliances, agreements that allowed lesser houses to survive in a world increasingly hostile to traditional nobility. And in every case, beyond the country, the same cultural clash repeated itself. The American women came from a practical world, a world where money was spoken of without euphemisms, where problems were solved, where efficiency had value. Many had grown up watching their fathers make quick decisions, fire employees, invest, sell, buy. They arrived in Europe with that mindset and found a system where time seemed to stand still. The European aristocracy operated according to unwritten rules: long silences, invisible hierarchies, an obsession with the way things are done simply because they had always been done that way. Changing something was not an improvement, it was a threat. And for many dollar princesses, that rigidity became a gilded cage. There were palaces, yes, but there were also cold rooms, both physically and emotionally. There were servants everywhere, but very few people with whom they could speak sincerely. There were receptions, but no intimacy. And there was a constant expectation to play the role of the grateful American well, without questioning too much the system that had absorbed her. Here it is important to return, even briefly, to Consuelo Vanderbilt, not to repeat her story, but to understand her symbolic function. Consuelo became a silent point of reference, not because every story was identical to hers, but because her marriage proved that the exchange was possible on a grand scale. She was the proof of concept. After her, Many American families understood that Europe was open to money, and many European families understood that America could be a lifeline. But she was also a warning. Her unhappiness, although often concealed in public, circulated in private. And even so, the system continued. Because when so much is at stake, castles, titles, inheritances, individual well-being is rarely the priority. Not all the dollar princesses were unhappy. Some managed to adapt, to find their own spaces, even to exercise real influence within their new families. Others used their position to promote cultural projects, restorations, philanthropy. But even in the most successful cases, there was a common denominator. None of them arrived in Europe on equal terms. They were always the side that had to prove something, the side that had to compensate with money for what they could not contribute in blood. And while this silent flow of American women was transforming the European aristocracy from within, another phenomenon was developing in parallel. Because not all the Americans who crossed the Atlantic did so to marry or to place their daughters in an ancient family tree. Some looked at Europe with an even more direct logic, less symbolic, more tangible. Because if a marriage could save a castle, perhaps a check could buy it outright. But not all the Americans came only to marry. Some came to buy something even more tangible. There was a moment at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th when something unthinkable began to happen in Europe. Castles went up for sale, not as romantic ruins or historical curiosities, but as assets, as properties with a price, with a deed, with discreet negotiations in offices where, before, people spoke only of inheritances and lineages. For centuries, a castle was not something that was sold. It was lost in a war, it was confiscated after a betrayal, it was inherited or slowly abandoned. But selling it to a foreigner, and worse still, to a foreigner without a title, would once have been seen as a humiliation. However, economic reality began to break taboos that pride could no longer sustain. The reasons were almost always the same. Debts accumulated after generations of poor management or simply bad luck. Ever more aggressive taxes from states that no longer respected historic privileges. And above all, a maintenance cost impossible to justify in a world that had left feudal logic behind. A castle could be beautiful, but it did not produce money. It only consumed it. In France, the phenomenon was especially visible. Many noble families had survived the revolution with their properties, but not with their fortunes. Castles that had been centers of regional power became financial burdens. Some owners tried to open them to the public, others to rent them out for events, but many simply could not sustain them. And then unexpected buyers appeared. Americans fascinated by old stone, by towers, by the feeling of owning something that seemed to have stepped out of a history book. In Italy, the situation was similar, though with a different nuance. The unification of the country had redefined the relationship between nobility and state. Many palazzi and castles, especially in rural areas, lost their political and economic function. Maintaining them became an act of resistance rather than of financial logic. For some Italian aristocrats, selling to a foreigner was preferable to watching the property slowly crumble. And the Americans, with their enthusiasm and their money, seemed like ideal buyers. In the United Kingdom, the process was slower and more discreet, but just as deep. The great noble houses still stood, but many secondary properties, lesser castles, rural residences, historic estates, began to change hands. The British inheritance system, combined with ever harsher taxes, forced entire families to part with parts of their patrimony to save the core. And again, America was there to buy. For the American buyers, the experience was almost surreal. In their country, a 100-year-old house was already historic. In Europe, they were negotiating over buildings that had witnessed crusades, dynastic wars, religious reforms, revolutions. They were not just buying square footage. They were buying a narrative, a sense of permanence that no skyscraper could offer. And here something interesting happened. Many Americans restored those castles better than their former owners, not because they loved European history more, but because they had something the nobles no longer had: liquidity without emotional ties. An aristocrat could hesitate for years before selling a work of art or modernizing a structure, because each decision felt like a betrayal of his ancestors. An American, by contrast, saw the castle as a project, something that could be saved, updated, adapted. Roofs were repaired, walls reinforced, systems modernized. The castle shone again, not as a feudal symbol, but as a living property. For local neighbors, the situation was ambiguous. On the one hand, the castle was saved, jobs were created, abandonment was avoided. On the other, something had broken. Local history now had a foreign owner, someone who did not share the language, the collective memory, the ancestral relationship with the place. The castle was still there, but it no longer belonged to the same story. And that brings us to a key idea in this part of the story. For the first time, European history had foreign owners. Not temporary administrators, not allies, owners. People who could decide what got restored, what was sold, what was closed to the public, what was turned into a hotel, a private museum, or a personal residence. The past, which had always been inherited, could now be bought. This change had deep, if silent, consequences. It altered the relationship between territory and memory. It introduced market logic into places that for centuries had been protected, for better or worse, by the inertia of tradition. And above all, it reinforced a dangerous idea that money could not only enter history, but rewrite it. For many Americans, owning a castle was the end of the journey, the ultimate symbol of having crossed the invisible barrier that separated the nouveau riche from someone. But for others, it was not enough, because although a castle could be bought, there was still something missing that not even the oldest stone could guarantee. A castle could give prestige, a title could give recognition, but neither of the two could offer the most coveted thing of all, real antiquity in the blood. And that is where some Americans decided to go further, farther back in time, deeper into the idea of belonging, because they did not just want to live in history, they wanted to found it. But some Americans were not content with owning castles. They wanted something older still. Buying a castle was a statement, marrying into a title was a strategy. But there was a further step, much more ambitious, that some Americans began to imagine once they already had what had seemed impossible. They wanted to found dynasties, not just enter European aristocracy as rich guests, but become part of the system, stop being the outsiders, and start being those who have always been there. And that is where the story becomes stranger, because what they were attempting was not only social, it was almost biological. They wanted that in 100 years, no one would remember that the origin of that surname came from New York, Chicago, or Boston. They wanted their grandchildren to be European by natural right, not by checkbook. That dream, of course, was not stated out loud in those terms. People spoke of adaptation, of integration, of tradition. But in practice, it was a very concrete project, to turn new money into old blood and then make that mixture look inevitable. The first step was always the same: European education for the children. Boarding schools in England, French tutors, German preceptors. They were taught languages as if they were survival tools. They were educated in manners, in history, in cultural references that an average American had no need to master. They learned to speak about hunting, genealogies, art, protocols. They learned, above all, not to seem American. Because in Europe, in that world of titles and hierarchies, the accent was a document. The way one moved was a credential. The surname was a key, but behavior was the passport. And many of those heirs, born with millions, were molded from childhood to function as acceptable pieces on the European board. Then came the second step, identity change. Some adjusted their names so they would sound less industrial and more noble. Others adopted European family traditions as if they could be grafted on by sheer decision. There were families that began to celebrate European festivities with more devotion than American ones. Oil portraits were commissioned, genealogical trees were ordered that connected, even indirectly, with some respectable branch. They collected relics not for their artistic value, but for their symbolic effect. This has always been here. In some cases, the change was more drastic. Americans who became naturalized, who established permanent residence, who transformed their social lives until they were unrecognizable to those who had known them at the beginning. The Fifth Avenue mansion might be impressive, but the real leap came when the official home became an English estate or an Italian palazzo. When they stopped traveling to Europe and started living in Europe, the underlying ambition was clear, that the American surname would stop being an American surname. that money would cease to be an argument and become an invisible foundation, and that, as generations passed, the memory of the origin would fade like a stain in a tapestry. But here the great problem appears. Europe was not only a culture, it was a social machine with a long memory. Even if an American heiress married a count and lived 30 years in his castle, there would always be someone who remembered the dowry. There would always be a cousin, a neighbor, a social rival who would whisper, "Yes, but they come from money." And this could be tolerated in one generation, even in two. But to turn it into lineage, something was needed that cannot be bought: time. And time was not on their side. Moreover, most of these projects ran up against something much more human: the true identity of the children. Some heirs educated as Europeans felt like imposters in Europe and strangers in America. They were not fully accepted by the most rigid aristocracy, but they no longer fit naturally into their country of origin. That tension, being too American for Europe and too European for America, created a generation of rich cosmopolitan people who were sometimes profoundly adrift. And when they tried to consolidate the lineage, classic family conflicts appeared, only amplified: unhappy marriages, divorces, public scandals, contested inheritances. Because a dynasty is not built only with money and plans, it is built with internal stability, and that, even in the oldest houses, was rare. There was also a political limit. European monarchies and aristocracies were beginning to lose real power. The title could still exist, yes, but it meant less and less in practical terms. In some places, the old rules that protected the nobility were crumbling. In others, social pressure against the elites was becoming more aggressive, more ideological, more dangerous. In other words, just when some Americans finally managed to get in, the club began to catch fire. That is why most of them failed, not because they lacked enough money, but because the world changed faster than their plan. Many ended up as a curious footnote, an American heiress who became a countess, whose children intermarried, and whose grandchildren no longer kept either the title or the fortune. Others kept the property, but never achieved that sense of inevitable lineage they had sought. And even so, some partly succeeded. Not in the sense of founding a dynasty that would dominate Europe, but in something more subtle: creating hybrid families with American roots and European branches that learned to move in both worlds and to survive when one of the two became hostile. Because if this obsession with lineage taught anything, it was an uncomfortable truth. Money could build castles, could sustain titles, could even fabricate a life that seemed ancient, but it did not guarantee continuity. It did not guarantee that the surname would endure. It did not guarantee that the next generation would want to carry the same dream. And there the phrase fits that sums up the heart of this part. Money could buy the past, but not always the future. The future demanded something more: political stability, social acceptance, and a world that still believed in the very idea of aristocracy. But the 20th century was about to show that Europe would no longer be that fixed, eternal stage that the Americans had idealized. Because just when it seemed that American money had found its definitive place on the old continent, the world broke apart again. And then the world broke apart again. Until 1914, the system still seemed stable. Imperfect, full of tensions, but recognizable. The castles still stood, the titles still passed from generation to generation, and American money, although sometimes regarded with suspicion, had found its place within the old European order. Many believed that the worst that could happen were social scandals, failed marriages, or mismanaged fortunes. No one was prepared for what was coming. The First World War was not only a military conflict, it was a moral and symbolic fracture, an earthquake that shook the foundations of everything that had allowed the market of prestige to exist. Suddenly, Europe stopped being a stage of salons and discreet agreements. It turned into trenches, propaganda, suspicion, and extreme nationalism. And in that new climate, something changed irreversibly. The foreigner stopped being exotic and became dangerous. The rich Americans living in Europe, who had bought castles or married into titles, began to be seen differently. They were no longer curious guests or financial benefactors. They were, in many cases, rich foreigners in a continent impoverished by war. People with resources at a time when millions barely survived. And that generated resentment. In some countries, their initial neutrality aroused distrust. In others, their accent or their origin automatically put them outside the we. The aristocracy, which for centuries had functioned as a supranational network, began to break under the weight of nationalism. Being cousins no longer mattered. Being part of the same lineage no longer protected. The only thing that mattered was the passport and loyalty. Some Americans decided to leave early. They sold what they could, closed houses, returned to the United States with the sense that the European dream had ended sooner than expected. Others stayed, convinced that the war would be brief, that the world would return to its usual course. Many were wrong. When the First World War ended, Europe was no longer the same. Empires had fallen, monarchies had disappeared, inherited prestige had been stained by defeat, humiliation, or irrelevance. And although the market of prestige did not die completely at that moment, it was grievously wounded. But the worst had not yet come. The Second World War not only destroyed cities and lives, it definitively destroyed the idea that the European aristocracy was a stable refuge. And with it, it destroyed any illusion that American money could continue to buy a secure place within that world. The castles, which once had been symbols of continuity, became strategic targets. They were requisitioned by armies, used as barracks, hospitals, command centers. Some were bombed, others looted, many never recovered. The old stone, so desired by American buyers, turned out not to be immortal. Foreign owners found themselves in an impossible position. Having a castle was no longer a sign of status, it was a risk. A large building attracted attention, occupation, suspicion. In some cases, authorities confiscated properties simply for their strategic value. In others, the owners fled, leaving behind furniture, works of art, family archives that would disappear forever. And it was not only a question of buildings, the lineages themselves broke. European aristocratic families were annihilated, scattered, exiled. Sons killed at the front, fathers executed or imprisoned, entire branches erased by political decisions or by the simple randomness of war. The surname, which had once guaranteed protection, sometimes became a dangerous burden. For Americans tied to that world, the message was clear. There was nothing left to buy. Prestige was no shield. The title did not protect against military occupation. The castle did not guarantee safety. And money, although useful for fleeing, could not rebuild what was being lost. Many returned home in silence, not as cultural conquerors, but as survivors. Some with diminished fortunes, others with the bitter feeling of having bet on a history that had disintegrated. In the United States, the European narrative began to change. People no longer spoke of romantic castles and aristocratic weddings with the same excitement. Europe was now a wounded, dangerous, unpredictable continent. For the following generations, the idea of buying Europe ceased to make sense. The old continent no longer represented eternal stability or legitimacy. It represented risk, trauma, ruin, and above all, a past too heavy to pick up again. The wars had done something that neither taxes nor debts had fully achieved. They had broken the spell. The spell that had made people believe that European history could absorb anything, even the newest money, and turn it into something lasting. After 1945, the world entered a different logic. Stronger nation-states, democracies, republics, ideologies that openly distrusted the aristocracy. Titles survived in some places, but no longer as centers of power, rather as cultural vestiges. And for Americans, Europe ceased to be the stage where they could resolve their anxiety about legitimacy. The market of prestige, as it had existed for decades, had come to an end. What remained were empty castles, broken surnames, incomplete stories, and the certainty that that exchange, money for past, had been possible only in a very specific moment in history, a moment that the world wars closed forever. Because after so much destruction, something became clear that no one had dared say out loud before. Europe was no longer a place to play at being an aristocrat. There was an image that survived for decades, that of the American who arrives, buys a castle, strolls through ancient halls, and returns home whenever he wants, as if Europe were a private museum. That image is comfortable. It fits the myth of money always finding a way. But it is an incomplete version. Because in the midst of the wars and the fall of the old world, There were Americans who could not go back, not only for lack of money, but because of irreversible decisions, closed borders, marriages that became chains, wars that changed the rules from one day to the next. Some came to Europe thinking they were buying security, a title, a surname, an estate, a life of prestige. And when everything collapsed, they discovered something brutal. They had traded freedom for a place in a gilded cage. At first, the cage looked like a privilege. Over time, it became a trap. Imagine an American heiress married to a European aristocrat. At first, the story looks like a classic tale. Ceremonies, photographs, receptions, a castle with coats of arms at the entrance. But when war breaks out, that same woman stops being the count's wife and becomes the foreigner. Sometimes, the suspect foreigner. The foreigner useful for negotiation. The foreigner everyone looks at with suspicion because her passport no longer symbolizes glamour, but uncertainty. And not all could return to the United States even if they wanted to. Some had renounced their citizenship or let it fall into a bureaucratic limbo when they married. Others were trapped by their children, by their in-laws, by laws they did not control. And others simply because war does not ask your permission before closing the way. Ships stopped being luxury voyages. They became dangerous routes. Trains stopped being symbols of modernity. They became monitored corridors. And castles stopped being refuges. In some cases, they became targets. There were Americans, men and women, who remained in Europe because they thought it would be temporary. 1 year, and this will pass. One hard winter, and then normality will return. But normality did not return. And when they wanted to move, it was already too late. Marriage, which had once been a social contract, became an internal border. Because war does not only divide countries, it divides households. In those salons that once hosted dinners with ambassadors, new arguments entered that had no possible etiquette. Nationalisms, sides, loyalties, and sometimes ideologies. There is one especially cruel way in which these stories break, when the conflict does not arrive from outside, but from within the home itself. A European aristocrat may see the rise of an authoritarian regime as an opportunity to recover power, order, influence. He may feel that, at last, the world once again respects hierarchies. Meanwhile, his American wife, educated in a different political tradition with another cultural instinct, may see that regime as a moral abyss. And then, what had previously been a mismatched couple for personal reasons becomes something much more serious. A couple divided by history. In some families, the castle became a silent battlefield. Meals where nothing could be discussed, friends who stopped visiting, siblings who enlisted on opposing sides. And in the middle, someone who had crossed the Atlantic in search of prestige found herself living in fear, weighing every word, measuring every visit, asking herself whether her marriage was a refuge or a sentence. Sometimes, the clash was more direct. There were aristocrats who embraced the dominant ideology out of conviction, opportunism, or survival. And there were Americans who could not bear that transformation. Some tried to escape, others stayed for their children, others resigned themselves, and others simply broke. Because the price of ending up trapped is not always physical, it can also be psychological. There are stories of American women who ended up living in closed-off wings of the castle, isolated, with the staff shrinking every month, with letters that no longer arrived, with the sound of planes at night. Stories of American men who had invested fortunes in restoring properties and watched as the army requisitioned them or as war turned them into ruins in a matter of days. And not only material ruins, emotional ruins. Total loss could come in many forms. Sometimes it was a legal confiscation. The state occupies the property, turns it into a military hospital, then into an administrative building. And in the end, the owner has nothing. Sometimes it was a brutal confiscation. Troops enter, loot, burn, destroy family archives, paintings, furniture, letters, everything that had turned the place into a story. And sometimes it was a slower loss, post-war taxes, reconstruction, accumulated debts, collapsed markets. The castle remains, but it is an expensive skeleton, impossible to maintain. For someone who had come from America, used to thinking that money buys solutions, the lesson was devastating. You cannot negotiate with a war. You cannot bribe a bombing. You cannot persuade an ideology to respect your newly acquired surname. You cannot pay for the world to become what it used to be. And the most tragic thing is that many of these stories never made a big headline. They were not the famous such and such heiress. They were not the most talked about wedding. They were silent cases, surnames lost in records, burned letters, destroyed memories, families that never spoke of it again. Because returning also meant admitting failure. It meant saying, I went to buy history, and history crushed me. And that, for some people, was harder than the financial loss. In the end, as the 20th century advanced, many of these figures faded away. Some managed to return to the United States decades later, already elderly, with half-reconstructed lives. Others never went back, because they no longer really had anywhere to return to. They had burned bridges, had European children, had buried too much on the continent to leave it behind. And others died in Europe, not as aristocrats, but as people trapped by decisions made in times of luxury, decisions that in times of war became irreversible. And so, behind the grand tale of castles bought and titles acquired, an uncomfortable reality remains. There were Americans who paid the highest price for playing at belonging to a world that was falling apart. For many, the European dream ended up being a nightmare. When we walk through Europe as visitors today, when we stroll through a restored castle, sleep in a historic hotel, or walk through a perfectly kept park, we rarely think about who really paid for all that to remain standing. We see old stone, coats of arms, distant dates. We see history. But in many cases, what we are seeing is not just medieval or aristocratic heritage. It is something much more recent, though almost invisible. American money. After the World Wars, Europe was marked by destruction, ruin, and the urgent need for reconstruction. Many castles that had survived for centuries were on the verge of disappearing forever. Some were too badly damaged, others were too expensive to maintain for families that no longer had political power or economic resources. That was when something curious happened. Many of those properties could only be saved because, decades earlier, they had been sustained by fortunes from the United States. Today, a significant part of those castles functions as museums, places that receive tourists, schoolchildren, historians, spaces where the lives of kings, dukes, and counts are explained, but where it is rarely mentioned that, at a critical moment, it was an American dowry or a direct purchase that paid for the roof, the restoration of the main wing, or the preservation of an art collection. The narrative stops just before that uncomfortable detail, because it breaks the illusion of pure continuity. Other castles have been transformed into luxury hotels, rooms where visitors sleep beneath centuries-old beams, eat breakfast in former ballrooms, and feel, for a few hours, like part of a story that seems intact. But that modern comfort, the heating, the integrated electricity, the reinforced structures, is not always the fruit of the local nobility. Many times, it is the result of investments made when European owners could no longer sustain their own residences. And we are not talking only about isolated buildings. American money also left its mark on broader infrastructures. Private roads later turned into public routes. Gardens, parks, irrigation systems, urban restorations indirectly driven by huge dowries that allowed certain families to maintain their position for a few more decades. Even cultural institutions, foundations, art collections, libraries survived because at some point a foreign fortune prevented their dispersal or their sale piece by piece. What is interesting is that this legacy rarely carries a plaque. There are no monuments that say, "Funded by an American heiress." There are no official speeches acknowledging that exchange. History prefers to present itself as something organic, national, continuous. And yet beneath that surface lies a more complex reality. Modern Europe is partly supported by capital that was not born in Europe. Here, a fascinating paradox appears. For decades, many Europeans looked with distrust at those Americans who bought castles or married into titles. They were seen as intruders, as buyers without historical sensitivity. But with time, much of what is now considered European heritage exists thanks to the fact that someone from outside was willing to pay when the internal system could no longer do so. That does not make the Americans altruistic saviors. That would be too simple a reading. Many acted out of ambition, prestige, personal desire. But the result is undeniable. Without that money, part of the European landscape simply would not exist as we know it. And here the phrase fits that sums up this silent legacy. Europe does not remember their names, but it lives among their investments. It does not remember them because they do not fit the classic narrative. They are not founding kings or national heroes. They are foreign surnames associated with an uncomfortable moment of economic dependence. And yet, every time someone crosses a restored threshold, treads a floor that was on the verge of disappearing, or contemplates a collection saved from auction, they are walking on the consequences of that exchange. This invisible legacy also raises a broader question about how historical memory works. We tend to remember those who ruled, those who fought, those who signed treaties. But we forget those who paid the bill when the system stopped working. We forget silent capital because it does not fit well with epic. And that leads us inevitably to an uncomfortable question. A question that is not answered by looking at the past, but by looking at the present. Because if American money could sustain Europe in its aristocratic decline, what kind of money sustains our world today? And what invisible traces are we leaving now that will only become evident in 100 years? And here an uncomfortable question arises. There is an idea that is uncomfortable precisely because it sounds too simple, and yet it keeps haunting you once you connect all the pieces. Europe colonized America. Europe planted flags, imposed languages, drew borders, exploited resources, wrote entire narratives of superiority. For centuries, the flow seemed one way, the old world dominating the new. But then the late 19th century arrives, and the scene is reversed without firing a single cannon. Because while Europe kept believing that prestige was its natural right, America began to accumulate the most modern weapon of all, liquid capital. Not imperial armies, not colonial fleets. Money, and not just any money. Money so abundant and so fast that it did not even have the tradition to know how to be spent with dignity. And then the clash happens. Europe, which had exported power for centuries, begins to import it. Only it does not call it that. It calls it marriage, it calls it patrimony, it calls it patronage, it calls it a good investment. But underneath, the pattern is disturbingly similar to that of domination. A territory that needs resources accepts conditions. A group that has resources imposes its presence. The comparison seems provocative, but it is hard not to see it. Europe colonized America with political and military power. America bought Europe with economic and social power. It was not a visible conquest. There were no colored maps or treaties signed with red ink. There were dinners, there were balls, there were contracts, there were dowries, there were notarized deeds, there were restorations. There were smiles and photographs, titles granted, castles saved. And little by little, the continent that boasted of its antiquity ended up accepting something it would never have admitted out loud, that its history had a price. But here's where the question becomes truly interesting. What exactly was being bought? Because a castle is stone, a collection is a set of objects, a title is a word. And yet the real product being sold was more abstract: legitimacy. The American millionaires were not only buying castles, they were buying the feeling of belonging to a history that was not their own. And the European aristocrats were not only selling properties, they were selling a sort of invisible certificate. You are rich, but now you are also someone with a past. And that opens up a strange, almost cruel power game. Who was really dominating whom? Europe still had symbolic power. Aura, protocol, etiquette, a centuries-old narrative. America had economic power, the ability to pay, to sustain, to rescue, to rebuild. On the surface, Europe offered prestige and America bought it. But in practice, money began to dictate conditions. When an American family restored a castle that the aristocracy could no longer maintain, who was saving whom? When an heiress paid the debt of a noble house in exchange for a title, who was really winning? When a European surname survived thanks to foreign capital, was it still pure lineage, or had it become a brand sustained by investment? The answer is probably uncomfortable because it favors no one. It was not classic colonization, but neither was it an innocent purchase. It was something more subtle, an unequal exchange in which each side desperately needed what the other had. Europe needed money not to collapse. America needed history not to feel new. And in the middle, people were left. Because when we speak of America and Europe as blocks, Everything sounds elegant and abstract, but the reality was human and often brutal. Heiresses forced to marry in order to turn millions into a surname, humiliated aristocrats, smiling in public while they knew their world was being propped up by foreign money. Children raised to fit into an identity that was not their own, living as bridges between two cultures that despised and needed each other at the same time. In that sense, if this was a colonization in reverse, it was not a colonization of land, it was a colonization of symbols. And perhaps that is even deeper, because symbols are the last thing an elite is willing to lose. Europe could accept selling castles. What it did not want to accept was that it was selling its own moral authority. And there lies the trick. No one called it conquest, because a conquest without an army seems impossible. But the result looks far too much like a silent dominion. A foreign presence embedded in the heritage, in the lineages, in the ballrooms, in the bank accounts, in the continuity of surnames that, without that money, would have disappeared. So the question stops being, was it colonization, and becomes something more uncomfortable. What kind of empire is born when flags are no longer needed? Because classic empires can be seen. They have borders, they have uniforms, they have anthems. But modern power can be something else, a network of properties, debts, marriages, and economic dependencies. An empire that does not need to occupy a territory because it can buy its permanence. And if you think of it that way, the exchange between America and Europe stops being a social curiosity and becomes a dress rehearsal for something much larger. A world where money crosses cultures, buys symbols, rewrites belonging, and creates hierarchies without the need to physically conquer anything. That is why, when you look at the map of Europe today and see intact castles, lineages that survived, palaces turned into hotels, immaculate museums, a question appears of its own accord. How much of what we call tradition was, in reality, financed from outside? And then, almost without realizing it, you understand the phrase that connects this entire historical shift. Because if there was a silent empire in this story, it was not that of kings or ancient conquerors. It was the empire of money. Perhaps the quietest empire was the one that never had a flag. If this story were only a parade of tragedies, it would end up being comfortable, because the viewer likes to think that excesses are always punished and that castles bought with someone else's money end up empty, as if history automatically punished those who try to buy it. But no. In this market of prestige, there were losers, and there were very clear winners. And if you look closely, you discover that some of the moves made more than 1 century ago are still generating value today. Because the great mistake is imagining that all the Americans who crossed the Atlantic were naive, or that all the European aristocrats were passive victims of decline. There was everything. And among that everything, there was a much rarer kind of figure, the person or the family that understood the game before the others. Those who survived were not necessarily the richest nor the noblest. They were the ones who grasped a simple idea. Europe was not a museum. It was an economic system in transformation. And if you wanted to maintain a patrimony there, it was not enough to have a castle and a surname. You had to turn that symbol into a sustainable structure. Some American families arrived with an industrial mindset: management, accounting, investment, return. For them, a castle was not just a romantic fantasy, it was an asset, something that could generate income, reputation, connections. And cold as it may sound, that vision was precisely what allowed many properties not to crumble. In certain cases, the pattern repeats with an almost business-like logic. First, a purchase, a cheap castle for what it represented, sold by a noble house choked by taxes, debts, and maintenance. Then, a restoration, money invested where the former owners could no longer invest. And then, most importantly, a reconversion. The castle stops being merely an aristocratic home and becomes a venue for events, a seasonal residence, a social destination, a status symbol that can be used in public. In other words, it was not only about owning history, but about putting it to work. And Europe, for its part, also had winners. Because not all nobles limited themselves to selling out of desperation. Some did something that would have seemed unthinkable to their ancestors. They learned to manage like bourgeois. They became patrimony managers, negotiators, investors. They sold a part to save the rest. They swapped the mentality of "my land is my destiny" for the mentality of "my land is a balance sheet." Instead of sustaining palaces solely out of pride, they began to sustain them with actual income: rentals, tourism, agreements with the state, donations, cultural foundations. And at that point, the most ironic twist occurs. The very castles that once symbolized a closed world begin to survive by opening to the public. As if old power, in order not to die, had to turn itself into spectacle. That is what defines the fortunes that survived. They adapted. They became modern without ceasing to look ancient. Some inheritances that are still alive today, not always with the same visible surname, not always with the same public narrative, are sustained precisely because they did something that seemed contradictory. They accepted that aristocracy was no longer a political system, but a cultural one. And culture in the 20th and 21st centuries can be monetized. The most interesting thing is that this survival is not always noticeable. Because if a property still stands, the visitor may assume it has always stood. If a castle is immaculate, one tends to think it was cared for out of tradition. But many times what there was foreign capital, financial reorganization, and cold decisions made at a moment of crisis. And here, something else appears that is rarely said. Some of the fortunes that survived did so because they knew how to disappear, not literally, but socially. They stopped seeking headlines, stopped trying to be aristocracy on the public stage. They swapped glamour for discretion. They kept properties, yes, but with a low profile. Complex legal structures, distributed inheritances, wealth management advisors. As if, once they had understood the cost of spectacle, they had decided that the real luxury was not being seen. In other words, the winners learned a lesson that most did not learn in time. Prestige looks better when it does not seem purchased. And even so, if you look at the map of Europe with that idea in mind, you begin to notice traces. Properties that changed hands at the turn of the century and never reverted. Private collections that were saved or relocated, thanks to American money. Lineages that kept a lifestyle only because someone, at some point, accepted that tradition without income was slow ruin. It is tempting to look for a single victor in this story, but the reality is more unsettling. The people who won were those who turned prestige into a business, those who understood that title, castle, and history were power, but only if they could survive the next crisis. And that explains why, when the wars arrived, not everyone fell the same way. Those who had built a solid base, economic, legal, administrative, had something that was not visible in the salons: resilience. The rest had only appearance, and appearance, when hunger or confiscation or exile arrive, is worth nothing. In a sense, this part of the story has an almost silent ending. There is no great scene of triumph, there is no coronation, there is no applause. What there is continuity, a property that remains standing, a surname that still appears on private invitations, a patrimony that still generates income, a family that, 1 century later, is not famous, but has not disappeared either. And then you realize what was truly at stake from the beginning. It was not just buying history, it was deciding who would have the right to keep it. Because in the end, when the dust settles and decades pass, the public tends to remember the romantic part, the American heiress, the duke, the castle. But what defines the outcome is something else, far less cinematic, who knew how to manage the past as if it were the future. And with that idea comes the inevitable twist. For every fortune that survived, there were dozens that left behind no continuity, no solid lineages, no pristine castles. They left something more fragile, and for that very reason, more powerful for a storyteller: a void, a mystery, a cluster of lives that ended with no clear conclusion, as if the market of prestige had devoured its own buyers and sellers. But most did not leave dynasties, they left questions. When a story ends without clear winners, without coronations or spectacular ruins, it tends to disappear from collective memory with an unsettling ease. It leaves no memorable dates, it leaves no statues, it leaves gaps. And the market of prestige, that silent exchange between American money and European nobility, is full of them. Unlike the great classic dynasties, many of the families that took part in this phenomenon did not leave a clear line to follow. Not because they were unimportant in their time, but because their importance was brief, uncomfortable, and sometimes deliberately forgotten. Between wars, divorces, rushed sales, and changes of country, the traces splintered. One of the first problems in reconstructing these stories is the lineages that are impossible to trace. Surnames that appear strongly for 1 or 2 decades and then dissolve. Americans who adopted European titles and whose children changed their names again. Branches that died out without recognized male descendants. Others that mixed so much that the origin became irrelevant even to their own descendants. Added to this are the lost archives, not always by accident. Some records disappeared in bombings, yes. Others were lost during military occupations, looting, or forced relocations. But there were also archives that were destroyed by deliberate choice, letters burned, diaries hidden, documents that it was not convenient to keep because they told an uncomfortable story, forced marriages, financial deals disguised as romance, conditional inheritances, breakups that no one wanted to explain to the next generation. And then there are the forgotten children. Children born in marriages that never worked, children raised away from the spotlight, sent to boarding schools, to other countries, to other branches of the family. Children who did not inherit titles because laws or customs did not recognize them. Children who grew up knowing there was something in their past, but with no clear story to hold on to. In many cases, silence was a form of protection. For some families, talking about the European past meant talking about failure, humiliation, or decisions that no longer made sense in the modern world. It was easier to start again, to be simply another American family, to let the castle, the title, or the old surname become a vague anecdote, half told or not told at all. Thus, one of the strangest phenomena in this story occurs: the dilution of identity. People who, in another era, would have been considered part of the European elite end up living completely ordinary lives, not because they fell into dramatic disgrace, but because the narrative was cut, because no one took charge of keeping it alive, because it fit neither European pride nor the American myth of individual success. From a historical point of view, this creates dark zones, family trees that break off without explanation, records that mention lavish marriages with no follow-up, properties that change hands without any trace of why, as if history refused to end neatly. And here, an inevitable but necessary speculation enters if we want to grasp the true magnitude of the phenomenon. It is possible that today there are people who ignore the price their family paid for a title. People who do not know that a fortune was sacrificed to buy a surname, that a life was reorganized to sustain a castle, that an entire generation lived with expectations that were never fulfilled, not because someone hid it from them with malice, but because silence ended up being more comfortable than explanation. This forgetting is not trivial. It reminds us of something fundamental. Not all history is preserved because it is important. It is preserved because someone decides it deserves to be remembered. And these stories, trapped between two worlds, often had no one to defend them. They were not heroic enough for Europe. They were not successful enough for America. And so they disappeared. Only fragments remain: an old photo, a letter with no context, a strange surname in a civil record, a property that is now a hotel and that no one any longer associates with the family that bought it more than 1 century ago. The market of prestige did not only produce restored castles or lost fortunes, it produced stories with no heir. And perhaps that is the deepest consequence of this whole exchange. Not that money could not buy the past, but that the past once bought sometimes stops wanting to be told. With that idea, we reach the end. Because everything we have seen, the money, the titles, the castles, the wars, the losses, and the silences, converges in one last reflection on what remains and what is erased. And that brings us to the end of this story. There are stories that seem built to impress, ships crossing the Atlantic with trunks full of dresses, new jewels, impossible checks, American mansions so large they look like European palaces. And on the other side, castles with centuries of dust accumulated, ancient titles, coats of arms, portraits of ancestors looking down from the walls as if they still expected something from those who inherit their surname. For 2 hours, we have followed that collision. And now, when everything turns off, the weddings, the headlines, the toasts, the salon gossip, only the one thing that always remains at the end is left: the bill. Not just the financial one, the other one. The one that is almost never seen. Because yes, American money bought castles, bought land, bought restorations, bought furniture, archives, halls, private chapels, art galleries. It bought the stone, it bought the image. But what it could not buy was what those stones meant. It could not buy a real feeling of belonging. It could not buy the peace of feeling from there. It could not buy the sincere gaze of a society that, deep down, did not see them as equals but as a temporary solution, as an elegant patch. It could not buy the invisible place occupied by those who have been somewhere for centuries, that place which is not signed in a contract, not transferred with an inheritance, and not fixed with a dowry. And here lies the cruelest contrast in this story. The Americans crossed the ocean believing they were buying a higher form of status, when in reality they were entering a system that ran on rules they had not invented. They believed money was the universal language, and it is, but it is not always enough to be accepted as one of us. In many cases, Europe needed them, and at the same time kept them at a distance. It opened the castle doors to them, but not always the doors of the heart. It gave them the title, but not always the respect. It allowed them to finance the continuity of an elite, but did not guarantee they would truly belong to it. And that is why, when we look back, the story leaves a strange echo. It is not an epic of conquest, nor a simple romantic tragedy. It is something more uncomfortable. It is the demonstration that status, when pursued obsessively, can become an elegant form of loss. Because what was bought many times was not a dream. It was an impossible expectation. Consuelo Vanderbilt is the example, yes, but she is not the only one. Behind every dollar princess, there was a price. Lives rearranged, identities changed, accents corrected, religions negotiated, children raised to fit into a world that might never look at them without reservations. And when the wars came, when the regime changes arrived, when new ideologies appeared, the castle stopped being a stage and became a burden. History stopped being an ornament and turned into a danger. And many of those ties, so carefully constructed, were broken as easily as a sheet of wet paper. So in the end, the recap is simple, even if it hurts. Money bought castles. It did not buy belonging. And then comes the inevitable question, the one that turns all this into more than just a story about the past. Is it worth buying prestige? Not the symbolic prestige that is earned through work or reputation, but that other kind. The shop window prestige, the one that is inherited or acquired by association. The one that seems to open doors, but demands an invisible toll. Is it worth living inside a historical set if you never quite feel it is yours? Is it worth carrying a surname if it only serves for people to look at you, but not to understand you? Is it worth buying an identity if that identity is not born with you and the world knows it? And then there is an even more uncomfortable question, because it does not look at the 19th century. It looks at us. What are we buying today without realizing it? Today, we do not buy noble titles with the same ease, but we buy other things that serve the same function: symbols, access, associations, belonging. We buy status in the form of brands, experiences, circles, exclusivity. We sell ourselves the idea that if we acquire the right things, we will be seen differently. And perhaps 100 years from now, someone will tell a similar story about our time. Not about castles, but about other invisible thrones, platforms, digital fortunes, financial empires, networks of influence. And perhaps then they will ask the same question. How much of that was real? And how much was just the desire to be someone in the eyes of others? Because that is the real thesis left standing when the spotlights go out. That status, pursued as the ultimate goal, rarely brings peace. And that purchased prestige always has a crack, the suspicion that it is not legitimate. And so the final line is not a dramatic twist. It is a simple, almost inevitable conclusion after everything we have seen. The American millionaires bought Europe, but Europe never entirely belonged to them. Not entirely, because Europe was not just land and stone. It was memory. It was blood. It was invisible social codes. It was a way of looking at the world that is not sold with a deed and not paid for with a dowry. And yet, even if it never fully belonged to them, they left something there. They restored castles, propped up decaying dynasties, altered marriages, changed inheritances, moved pieces. An empire without a flag, without an army, without a capital. An empire made of checks, salons, and silences. And like all silent empires, its trace is not always in the books. It is in the walls, in the erased names, in the incomplete archives, in the portraits where an American woman looks at the camera from a European castle with perfect elegance and a distance impossible to hide. There the final image remains, and with it, the final thought. Perhaps the real price of status is not paid with money, but with something far harder to recover, with the life you might have lived if you had not tried to buy another.